Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Prayers of Renewal, Biblical Inspiration in the Liturgy of Yamim Noraim with Adina Bblaustein. I think most of you have joined us for classes in the past, so I assume you've either were here last week or have seen Ms. Blaustein's bio or and the topic. So I think we should just jump in. I think that's about it. It's pretty straightforward. So
Wonderful.
thank you
Thank
so
you
much for
so
being
much,
here.
Kaya. Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. This is the second class of this series, so it's a wonderful opportunity for me to express Hakarat HaTov for the folks at Jerisha and giving me this opportunity to teach. I love teaching. Thank you all for joining and engaging. This Saturday evening, this Motzei Shabbat, Ashkenazim will gather together in shul, and as soon as you hear that very first Kaddish with that very particular nusach of the high holidays, it's the opening salvo of the Yamim Noraim. Of course, for our Sephardic brothers, they've started a while ago reciting Selichot, but for Ashkenazim, it's this Motzei Shabbat where we really begin and where we really set the stage more formally in turning our liturgy around to begin the process of preparing for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Last week, I discussed how the David Hashem Ori, Psalm 27, is a part of this liturgy. And now I want to focus on Selichot. And it's worth noting, although this is not at all the topic for this evening, since I brought up Sephardim and Ashkenazim, really interesting if you've ever had the opportunity, if you're Sephardic, of attending Ashkenazic Selichot or vice versa. Sephardic Selichot are overall much more upbeat, much more joyous, and in general, not just in the tone, in the tunes, but in the piyutim themselves. And Ashkenazic piyutim, in the tunes and in the poems themselves, the piyutim are a bit more solemn and sadder. But although you might read a particular piyut or hear a particular tune and feel like it's very different, in general, Selichot are pretty much structured very similarly. They are really an appeal to God's mercy with the 13, the Yud Gimel Mitzvot HaRachamim, those 13 attributes of mercy, and this vidoy, this confession, as the center structure around which those added poems are framed. What I'd like to do this evening is to explore a time period in Jewish history that I think was foundational in generating this custom, and I think can shed light on the particular emotions that perhaps we're meant to be experiencing or meant to be feeling when we recite Selichot. Now, when we think about how prayer formed or what inspired prayer, I think for many years, had the experience of feeling like the Siddur has just static. It's always been this way. It's on the shelf. If if in your shul has kind of those old Birnbaum Siddurim and or the Chumash, and you pick it up and you're like, well, it's always been this way. The language is always the same. But the truth is, the Siddur was formed over many years, and Jews throughout generations kind of added to it. And even today, in the newer Siddur and machzor that are being formed, there are prayers being added, and we are still shaping prayer. But for the most part, the core of our prayer is pretty fixed. When we look at a section of prayer, Selichot in particular, there are really three, I would say, key foundational texts that are really the building blocks to what we call Selichot. So the first is from the book of Exodus in the aftermath of Egel. This is obviously the main one, when God teaches Moses the 13 attributes of mercy. And this is really the main building block of the Selichot prayers. The piyutim surround these. I really love how Sefaria has organized it on their site as chapters, and each chapter is almost like another round of recitation of the 13 midot, followed by the Salachti Kedvarecha, and we basically go through cycles of repeating that. Yom Kippur, as the day wanes and we're in Ne'ilah, we do this with increasing urgency. The piyutim in between get shorter and shorter, think that's really interesting that in the beginning of Selichot, when we begin reciting in a Motzei Shabbat, it's farther and farther apart, and then it kind of becomes more and more frequent in the urgency and in the frequency as we recite the 13 attributes. That's obviously the first text. The second text is from the book of Daniel. This is the prayer, Hatei Elokai Aznecha. You can see these verses on the screen. Look at verse 18. But this entire piece, I'll put up a page from Selichot. You can see the text of Selichot on the screen, and you can immediately see the parallel verses or the parallel phrases. But Daniel, in the court of Belshazzar, this Persian emperor, is this young Jewish boy. He's this trusted officer rising in the Persian court. And in a court that is dangerous and lonely for a young Jewish man, he has this audacious message to calculate that the 70 years, which everybody thinks are up and yet no Geula have happened, he is the one who kind of is experiencing this along with the whole Jewish community, who are all feeling this sense of dread of, well, we all thought the 70 years were over and yet no redemption has come. I guess that means that it's never coming. And so he prays that prayer, this famous prayer that we'd include in our Selichot. In his book, this prayer comes at this point in his life, this incredibly low point where he and his community are all wondering, I guess redemption is never happening. And he is praying to God, please incline your ear, see us, see how we are, do not delay. It's quite evocative if you can think about the context. And what happens in the book of Daniel is the angel Gabriel basically comes and tells him, you are mistaken in your calculations. And that provides him with a lot of encouragement. So that's the second key foundational text for Selichot. The third key text is from the book of Tehillim, and numerous piyutim draw phrases and verses from the book of Psalms, too many to begin quoting, but all of these poetic turns of phrase really capture a sense of guilt, a sense of longing that we have, and it's almost like as Jews sat down and they kind of said, well, what should Selichot be? They pulled from these three texts, and here we have it. But there's another text that, from a liturgical standpoint, if you're just comparing words, the number of words really doesn't feel like it has so much influence on Selichot. But in my opinion, it's completely foundational to understanding the mindset of Selichot. And obviously my title gives it away. I think it's the book of Nehemiah, where it's a text that's not often studied, but I think that the book of Nehemiah really is foundational in understanding Selichot and in understanding the formulation of Selichot. So I'll give you the few examples to start with, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into the themes of the book of Nehemiah to explore, and I'll try to demonstrate why I think it is that to understand Selichot and the formulation of Selichot and the connection of Selichot and Rosh Hashanah and the Yamim Noraim, why you really do need to look at the book of Nehemiah. So for starters, I'll just go through a few key allusions from the book of Nehemiah that we'll see in Selichot. So one of the famous allusions is this idea of Tehina aznecha kashevet. May your ears be open and listening. This you see on the page. These are phrases that are repeated many times throughout Selichot, where you see this in the second paragraph, where we basically ask God to incline his ears. I'm sorry, in the first paragraph, if you see where my pointer is, Tiena aznecha kashuvot lekol tachanunenu. And I'm sure these words are vaguely familiar to you because you recite them so many times. You're about to recite them so many times throughout this time of year. These words are from Nehemiah. I'll give you another example. This is much more famous. The phrase Eloka haslichot. Think about how throughout Yom Kippur, and throughout really the Yamim Noraim, that way of turning to God and saying Elokah Slichot, God of Slichot, God of forgiveness, is really what the sense of the phrase is. How many times you recite it? That's from Nehemiah 2. So, okay, key phrases, not terribly important phrases. I mean, I'm not going to stand and argue that Nehemiah is more key to formulating these prayers than the 13 midot. It's obviously key. It's obviously completely lifted from the Chumash. But what I really want to demonstrate is that perhaps while the actual lines of the liturgy might not be completely drawn from Nehemiah, in Nehemiah we really see the first expression of a communal slichot connected to the Yamim Noraim. And the particular slichot in Nehemiah, I think they were reciting slichot. It's born out of a time period of distress and challenges, but also optimism and determination. And so in order to understand what motivated Nehemiah's slichot, I want to just try to explore a bit with you the challenges of that time period and set up some context for Rosh Hashanah and slichot in Nehemiah's day and age. So let's get our bearings a bit as to when this person, Nehemiah, lived and what that time period was. So the book of Nehemiah, or really the book of Ezra Nehemiah, because it's really one book that for expedience and because of helpful Christians who decided it should be called two books, that we call it Nehemiah, but really it's one book, the book of Ezra, really. And the timeline, as you see, is after the fall of the first temple, we have a Judean community in Babylonia. And then we have this Persian emperor Cyrus, who is emperor over Mesopotamia, emperor over this Persian empire, which covers this vast land. And he makes this incredibly important decision to basically allow Judeans to go back to rebuild the temple. So together, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah cover three key stages in the movement called Shivat Zion, the movement of rebuilding the Second Temple, the early days of the Second Temple period. And just from a chronological standpoint, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, these are the latest books in Tanakh. When you open a Tanakh, they're not the last books you'll see, but if you're just creating a timeline of the books of Tanakh from a chronological standpoint, these books are the last books. So let's just kind of situate what's going on in the action. Judeans are in Bavel and Babylonian Empire crumbles, the Persians take over, and Cyrus, the Persians, they really deal with the same challenges that the Assyrian Empire and then the Babylonian Empire all face, which is like, how do you control this massive empire with so many different ethnicities all in one empire and just ensure peace and that people don't rebel, because rebellion means war and war is expensive. So each empire had a different way of dealing with this challenge. The Assyrians, they used brute force, massive army, but that meant they were constantly conquering new territories to feed their massive army. And they relied on exiling populations just completely in order to unsettle people, to keep the peace and to quash rebellion. So the 10 lost tribes, that was an example. They were exiled by the Assyrians. That was their way of basically saying, you rebel, that's it, you're exiled. And while they were able to maintain power for a very long period of time, they couldn't keep up eventually, and so they crumbled. Next, the Babylonians. To control their massive empire in the same exact geographic territory, basically, they had this setup where they would go into a land and they would set up a vassal king. They would basically ensure that the local king would be loyal to the Babylonians, pay heavy taxes, but they had a series of power-hungry, very poor politicians who were the last few series of their kings, left them very vulnerable, and they collapsed after kind of a short run, and their empire was then incorporated by the Persian Empire. So then we have the Persians, led by Cyrus, and they found this Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus himself rules for about 30 years, and he tries something new for their vast empire, again, covering Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the same geographic area. He had the same problem of the Assyrians, Babylonians. How do you control this massive empire? And so they had this goal, which is they wanted to raise taxes to fund their government and their army. And so to do so, they decided that they would allow all the various different tribes and ethnicities to return back to their origin lands and rebuild their temples, with the idea that if the people are happy, led by their own religious leaders, then surely they'll just stop complaining and pay taxes. And that's the very cynical explanation for what you see on the screen, which is the Cyrus cylinder, or the Edict of Cyrus. And the inscription itself has a somewhat more religious tone, where Cyrus basically credits Marduk, if you have any relatives named Mordechai, or if you're familiar with the book of Esther, right? Mordechai is after their Persian god Marduk. So he opens with this dedication to exalted Marduk. He changed his mind about all the settlements whose sanctuaries were in ruins, and the population of the land of Sumer and Akkad, who had become like corpses, and took pity on them. He inspected and checked all the countries, seeking for the upright king of his choice. He took the hand of Cyrus, king of the Anshan, and called him by his name, proclaiming him aloud for kingship over all of everything. And then it switches to first person. I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king. He's very humble also. King of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world. I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. And you can see the beginning of the book of Ezra begins by referencing Cyrus's declaration. Bishnat achat leKoresh melech Paras lechlot devar Hashem mipi Yirmiyah ha'ir Hashem et ruach Koresh melech Paras v'ya'aver kol bechol malchuto v'gam b'mechtav lemor ko amar Koresh melech Paras kol mamlechot ha'aretz natan li Hashem elokei hashamayim v'hu fakad alai levnot lo bayit b'Yerushalayim asher b'Yehuda. Now, the English is on the screen. The first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord roused the spirit of the King Cyrus to issue a proclamation. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. I want to point out that I think sometimes we look at external commentaries to Torah. Rashi, Ramban, I grew up learning so much of these brilliant commentaries. As I grew older, I became a little bit more aware, certainly in my day job working at Aleph Beta. This is my teacher, Rabbi Foreman's real area of expertise. Tanakh's commentary on itself, intertextuality, right? Where Tanakh references other stories in Tanakh, and where it's clear that it's almost winking and nudging you to consider two stories in light as you're reading a text. But sometimes Tanakh does what it does here, which is it's pointing you to something outside of Tanakh. It's almost like an external text. And here, make no mistake about it, it's basically mocking the Cyrus cylinder, right? In the Cyrus cylinder, Cyrus opens by saying, it was Marduk who moved Cyrus to do this. And Ezra is basically saying, oh, it wasn't Marduk. He'ir Hashem et ruach Koresh. It was God who moved him. And secondly, Cyrus opens on the Cyrus cylinder with, I sarcastically said those very humble words, I am Cyrus, king of the universe. And the book of Ezra, the prophetic narrator here says, oh, Cyrus himself is humbly saying, the Lord God of heaven has charged me with this. So you see those two changes. And then the last change, in the Cyrus proclamation, the Cyrus edict, he is issuing this for all nations, all ethnicities in his vast territory to go back to their homelands and rebuild and restore their temples across Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, across this broader region. He is not singling out the Judeans. But in the book of Ezra, this is where you see the prophetic narrator telling us that this is God's hand in history, moving Koresh, moving Cyrus to do something for the Judeans. And even though Cyrus would not have picked the Jews out of a lineup and said, I'm doing this for you, the Navi, the prophetic narrator who is telling this story, is telling the Jews, don't you see, this is God acting through history. You have to come and rebuild. So this kicks off the first wave of the time period called Shivat Zion. And in part of this first wave is a governor named Zerubbabel. He's a descendant of the last Judean king. And he leads a relatively small group of people back to Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel, literally his name means seed of Bavel. He has some Davidic blood, but he is not a real king. There's no real political independence. There's a lot of tension with the locals in the land, the Shomronim. And there's also tension with Jews themselves who never went to Babylonian exile, Jews who were in Israel that whole time. And there's these challenges of who's the insider, who's the outsider. And that theme of who belongs and who doesn't continues to be a source of tension throughout the movement of Shivat Zion, throughout the second major movement, which is Ezra. And he faced this challenge that truthfully any aliyah, even in modern Israel, we face, which is how much do we risk losing our unique Jewish identity as we expand the Jewish community? So Yeshayahu, Zechariah, these books have a very universalistic view, and Ezra and Nehemiah are not very idealistic books. They're very practical about drawing lines. Their response to intermarriage was to openly encourage divorce, not to encourage conversion. So Ezra leads the people in this restoration and commitment to the covenant. And that brings us to the third movement, the book of Nehemiah. So the book opens by introducing us to Nehemiah, who is in the Persian court, and he works as a cupbearer to the king. And it's unclear how exactly the timeline lines up with the book of Ezra, because Ezra appears as a character in the book of Nehemiah. So these two books, it's very difficult to establish a linear timeline where the first book happens and the second book. It's either 12 or 30 years after the book of Ezra, or maybe it's the same time. Anyway, he hears about the challenges that the Judeans are facing in Jerusalem, and he decides to do something about it. And the opening chapters of the book of Nehemiah really illustrate in such a terrifying way what it must have been like to be a Jew during this time period, how they were never really independent. They're completely at the whims of this terrifying foreign emperor. And you even see some parallels to Megillat Esther that really emphasize, in the book of Nehemiah, that really emphasize, I think, the vulnerability of Jews during this time period, how it's all up to the king, all up to the whims of the king. And so it opens with Nehemiah in the palace in Shushan. Look at the first verse. Vayhi bechodesh kislev shnat esrim va'ani hayiti b'Shushan habira. And I'm in the capital city in Shushan. And a group of people from Judah come to visit him. Vayvo Chanani echad ma'achai v'hu v'nashem Yehuda v'shalem al Yudim ha'pleta asher nashru min hashavi v'al Yerushalayim. And he asks them how fare the Jews living in Jerusalem who have survived Babylonian captivity. I know these are people who have struggled their whole lives. And the report that he gets back is somewhat strange because it's kind of random of all the things to say. So first they start off by saying, oh, they're doing badly, and it's a disgrace. And you're thinking that he's going to tell us, oh, the people are so poor, or there's so much antagonism with the enemies. And then of all things, he said, the walls of the city are broken, usharan, it's tu ba'esh, and its gates are destroyed by fire. And Nehemiah just like hears that and weeps and fasts for days. It really, really stresses him out. The kind of funny part, though, is that I'll just pull that timeline back up. The walls, so let's say Nehemiah is around here, 445 BCE. The walls have been destroyed by fire since 585 BCE. So over 100 years, the walls have been destroyed and the gates have been burned by fire. And only now Judeans have come back to Nehemiah and told him, what do you know it? Those walls are destroyed. And he's like, I must pray to God. This is terrible news. And it's interesting. I mean, I think there's many different explanations for why Nehemiah is so troubled now. Is it that the temple has already been rebuilt and he's wondering, are they not going to rebuild the city walls? Does that mean that redemption hasn't fully come? What's a rebuilt temple without the larger city walls? Think about the promises of Yeshayahu. But this really kicks off the plot of the book of Nehemiah, which is we need to rebuild the city walls. Okay. But look at his prayer, which is those verses that I was just pointing out from Selichot. He immediately turns to God in prayer. Hakel, Hagadol, Hanara, Shomer Habrit v'chesed la'ohavav u'l'shomer mitzvotav. Great, awesome God, you're faithful to your covenant. You're faithful to those who love you. Tehi na aznecha kashevet ve'einecha ptuchot l'shma el tfilat avdecha asher anochi mitpalel f'necha hayom. Let your ear be attentive to receive the prayer of your servant, that I'm praying to you. And then if you skip on a few verses, Zechorna et hadavar shetzivita et Moshe avdecha lemor atem timalu va'ani afitz etchem ba'amim. Be mindful of the promise you made to your servant Moses. If you're unfaithful, I'm going to scatter you among your people. But then obviously it goes on, and then I'll collect you. So Nehemiah's response is to immediately turn to God in prayer. He is saying a version of Vidoy, isn't he? He's mourning, he's fasting, he's saying, look at verse 6, I confess the sins that we Israelites have committed against you. And it's no surprise that snippets of these phrases make their way into Selichot. Another key theme, Nehemiah implores to God to remember, Zechorna, which also is a phrase that appears, it's always the closing of Selichot. We always have that paragraph of Zechorna, different words, but we use that theme. And the truth is, in the book of Nehemiah, if we were just doing a class on that, which I'd be delighted to do, that word, Zechorna, appears over and over and over again. It's a very key word for the book of Nehemiah. And in Rosh Hashanah, it's also a really key word. We even call the Torah's nickname for Rosh Hashanah is Zichron Trua. It's the original Yom HaZikaron, right? It's the day of remembrance. And it's key for the prayers of Selichot as well. So this, it's already we're seeing some connections between some of the themes of Selichot and the book of Nehemiah. But I want to add another layer, which is Nehemiah's job is to be the cupbearer to the king. And in the beginning of chapter 2, you see this in a very terrifying way described, in a way that I think describes the vulnerability of what it must have been like for somebody like Nehemiah to live in the court. In the month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, this is not the Achashverosh of Megillat Esther, wine was set before him. I took the wine and gave it to the king, and I had never been out of sorts in his presence. The king said to me, how is it that you look bad? Though you are not ill, it must be bad thoughts. I was very frightened. Why is Nehemiah so frightened? Just because the king is like, are you feeling okay? Like, you look kind of green. Well, some commentaries suggest that the job of the cupbearer is to taste the king's wine to make sure that there's no poison. And so while to be a cupbearer doesn't just mean you're the king's butler, it means that you're the person who the king is kind of looking at, wondering what plot is being hatched. And so Nehemiah probably took a sip of the wine. The king is anxiously looking at his face, sees Nehemiah discomfited, and immediately is thinking, is there a rebellion happening under my nose? And so you see Nehemiah was very frightened, obviously, because if the king is out of sorts, this paranoia could potentially impact Nehemiah negatively. This is such a situation that is so evocative of Megillat Esther, right? Where the master plan of saving the Jewish people is simply, let's just go ask the king. That's exactly what Nehemiah does. He just basically is like, you know what? Let me just ask the king, hey, can I have permission to go back to Jerusalem and basically fix the graveyard of the city? And it's a pretty innocuous request. The king responds favorably. Keep in mind, the temple's already built at this point. But as soon as Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, it's clear that things are much more complex, because his real motive is to muster the people and build the city wall, but it's really restore Jerusalem to its former glory. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this really isn't the focus, but this is exactly what Cyrus boasts about on the Cyrus cylinder, that all the walls, he's trampled all the walls of all the cities, and now Nehemiah is rebuilding the city walls. That's kind of interesting. And Nehemiah has just prayed to God and said, God is the king in chapter 1. And the book of Ezra opens by saying, God allowed the king Koresh to rebuild. And on Rosh Hashanah, we proclaim God as our king. So there's a really interesting tension of the people, the Judeans, totally lack a Davidic king. And on Rosh Hashanah, we proclaim God as our king. So I think there's also an underlying implicit theme here of the struggle of when you lack the Davidic king that you long for, your basically only recourse is to turn to God as your king. And that's a theme that I think the Shiva de Nechemta, the Haftarot that we read, also express during this time period as well. So it's a venture that is risky, because to rebuild the city walls and to emphasize the Judean God and to emphasize maybe even the Judean dynasty, the locals living in Israel probably would have been very suspicious of this venture, because they would have said, well, you're rebuilding the city walls. Like, is Artaxerxes okay with this? Or you call yourself governor now, are you going to call yourself king tomorrow? So very quickly, there's opposition. Sanballat, Tuvia, these Arabs, these Ammonim, these Ashdodites, and they are very angry, but I think we can almost sympathize with their anger and their fear of what Nehemiah is doing, because I think they're afraid that what if Nehemiah is really running this rebellion under their noses, and there really is a lot of antagonism in Nehemiah's efforts to rebuild the city walls. And there's so much antagonism that what Nehemiah has to do is, look at verse 10, he has to basically give people a bow and an armor in one hand and a trowel in the other. In other words, almost reminiscent of the Chalutzim building Israel in the early days. Basically, it's like, guys, if we're going to get this city wall built, I'm going to need half of you to hold guard while the other half of you are actually doing the bricklaying, because they're so scared of the antagonism. And so the city walls of Jerusalem during the times of Shivat Zion are not just magically built by God, like Yeshayahu describes, or built by the foreign nations themselves, but they're built by the Judeans themselves under deathly fear that at any moment their efforts are going to be attacked. And still they managed to do it. And in another somewhat evocative image of Rosh Hashanah, he basically stations, if you look at verse 12, Nehemiah basically says, if at any moment one of us standing guard hears the enemy coming, we'll blow the shofar, and then you'll all know we all have to rush to one section to stand guard and fight back. So it's interesting that the shofar is coming up here as well. So eventually they manage to make progress, summarizing obviously the next few chapters in the book of Nehemiah. And his vision, Nehemiah's vision of society, is slowly coming to become actualized, where there's a temple, there's a recommitment to God, a recommitment to Torah, and there's rebuilt city walls. And these are almost like 3 points of a triangle, the 3 key themes of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, the 3 key accomplishments. But after 52 days, they managed to build the wall, and the wall is only like 2/3 of the height that it formerly was, only really, or maybe even half as high as it used to be. We also learned that the taxes during this time period are so crippling that the people are pretty destitute. And we also learn in chapter 5, which I'm skipping over, that the people themselves have to sometimes sell themselves into indentured servitude because they're so poor, they need to survive. So the reality starts to hit people, which is, although it's so beautiful and it's so wonderful that Ezra and Nehemiah have led them in this recommitment to Torah and recommitment to the temple and recommitment to building the Jerusalem city walls, life is really, really, really hard. Nehemiah himself uses his income as governor of Judah to help people with the taxes and to provide people almost like a soup kitchen, and they're very grateful to him. But the narrative, once again, emphasizes that it's tough times. So how do you celebrate the accomplishment of rebuilding something that some people might cynically say isn't even that amazing under the threats that they experience? How is Nehemiah going to turn this moment to the people and say, guys, this is redemption, right? You should be excited. This is God working through history. The people are destitute. They had to build these city walls, fearing for their lives at any moment that Sanballat and his buddies are going to attack them. And the wall itself, when they finally finish, is only half as high. So it's not even like it's this grand achievement that's really going to offer them any material protection. It's a shadow of what it was in the previous generations. So how are you going to do this? How are you going to accomplish this? So he does something very interesting. He assembles all the people together for basically this ribbon ceremony. This is chapter 8 on the screen. So remember Ezra, right? He appears as a character. They bring Ezra in, and Ezra reads from the Torah. So they read a few psukim. What's that date? The first of the 7th month? It's Rosh Hashanah, right? So they have Rosh Hashanah basically together. And what do? They read from the Torah. And there's no shofar blowing here, right? I don't see any formal tikkiot. But aside from the date, right, there's no way you'd really know this is Rosh Hashanah. And Bible scholars certainly discuss what's going on here and do the timelines match up. It's not at all a topic for this time around. They're also not inside the Beit HaMikdash during this ceremony. It seems like they're outside the temple. And on this day that ostensibly is Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah and this beautiful Hakel ceremony, they just finished the walls, they read from the Torah, and it's a really incredible moment. Vayomer Nehemiah hi hirtashta ve'Ezra kohen hasofer v'halavim mevi'im et ha'am l'chol ha'am hayom kadoshu laHashem Elokechem al tedablu. All these leaders, Nehemiah, Ezra, the Kohanim, the Leviim, who were explaining the words of the Torah to the people, because the people probably forgot Hebrew, so they had to explain to them. They have to stop the people and say, guys, today's holy for Hashem, al tedablu, don't mourn, v'al tifku, and don't fast, ki bochim kol ha'am kishamam et divrei haTorah, because everyone was crying when they heard the words of the Torah. Why are they so sad? What are they reading? So some commentaries say maybe they were reading the curses from Vayikra or Devarim. Other commentaries were saying that they were simply reading the psukim that describe, Mikrai Kodesh from Parshat Pinchas, and it's a pretty short Torah reading actually, and they got up to Sukkot, and they were like, oh man, like, are we really going to be able to celebrate this year? The Torah has very, very few psukim that actually describe Rosh Hashanah, so it's not very many psukim to read. But simply put, why are they so sad? Look at what they're seeing. They're seeing this shadow of what they remember. They're ostensibly at what's meant to be a celebration, and yet it doesn't feel so joyous, right? It doesn't really feel like they have what to celebrate. And I think we can all relate to this. I'm already thinking, what will Simchat Torah Shmini Atzeret be like this year? What does it feel like when ostensibly it's a celebratory day, but you don't feel like you need to celebrate? You don't feel like you have what to celebrate. That's really hard. But the leaders tell the people twice, don't fast. And even look at verse 10. Vayomer lahem lechu echlu mashmanim. No, go eat good things, right? Go make yourself a nice yantif meal. Vishalchu manot, and go send mishlach manot, which we associate with Purim. Another interesting link to Megillat Esther, right? But back then, They sent packages of food around on holidays, and that was a practice that has since fallen out of favor. But basically, the leaders say to the people twice, so many emphasizing, no, today is not a fast day. You have to celebrate. You must celebrate. So it's really complicated. You can't just end this day. This is their public together Rosh Hashanah, which is also functioning like their celebration of finishing the city walls. That was this grand venture. That was the whole point of Nehemiah's career. That was the whole point of the book of Nehemiah. They finally finished the city walls, and it's Rosh Hashanah, and the people just want to cry and fast. So you can't just like send people home after these emotions are articulated. So what do? And here's where you see the brilliance of Ezra and Nehemiah, because all the leaders did so far is to just say, don't fast, right? Don't push your sad emotions aside. But instead, Nehemiah tells the people to stick around another few days. Stay one more day. Stay till after Selichot. Sorry, stay a few more days. And so on the 24th of the month, Ne'esvu b'nei Yisrael batzom basakim v'adama alehem. And he says, okay, after the holidays are over, on the 24th of Tishrei, this time you can fast. And this is where you see, I think, something that's like our Selichot. But what I want to point out to you is that it's separate from the festival, right? The people say, no, leave the festival for what it is. You have to compartmentalize. You have to leave a space to have a celebration, to have this coronation of God. But we also have to deal with your feelings of this is inadequate. This doesn't feel like it's the full redemption. This maybe even feels like, what are we doing? Paying taxes to a Persian king, and we don't even have a Davidic king, and we're not even allowed to openly say that because then we'll be accused of rebellion. So all of those feelings that are going to fester, you're going to stick around and look at the prayer that they recite. I want to point out to you 3 key elements in this prayer that are essentially a Selichot prayer. The first is, I think, the most obvious, which is what we associate as the major building block to Selichot, which is the Yud Gimel Midot. And so take a look at verse 17, that as this prayer, he acknowledges the people's stiff neck and acknowledges the people's defiance, but then he turns to God and he says, you are ve'ata Eloka Selichot, chanun, rachum, erech apayim, b'rav chesed, v'lo azavtam. You are forgiving, gracious, compassionate, long-suffering, abounding in faithfulness. You didn't abandon them. So Nehemiah weaves in references to the 13 midot into this prayer. That's element number 1. Element number 2, if you go back, it's quite long, so it's really 2 whole chapters. But if you go back and look at the verses on the screen, Nehemiah and Ezra, they provide this description of history. And in the description, there's an emphasis over and over again of, we sinned, and yet you remembered us. So those of the stock of Israel separated themselves from all foreigners, stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. So that's vidoy, which is a key element, which is element number 2 of our Selichot. We have a vidoy, a confession, right? We say the Asham Nu Bagadnu as part of the Selichot, so that's vidoy. And then there's also, you took note, you heard their cry, you made a name for yourself that endures to this day, you split the sea, you made known to them the holy Sabbath. He's basically reminding the people of God's enduring relationship with the people, this unbroken bond, despite everything and despite our sins. And he acknowledges and it goes on, right? He recounts the golden calf. He recounts the 40 years in the wilderness. He recounts the times when you came to Israel and you grew fat and then you rebelled, you defied, you ignored the Torah. He includes all of that into the prayer. But then he ends in verse 32, V'ata Elokeinu akel gadol gibor b'hanara shomer habrit. He basically says, and yet despite all of this, you kept our covenant sacred. So these 3 key elements that you see in Ezra and Nehemiah's prayer with his people during this incredibly stressful and difficult time, when the people are feeling so down, when they're feeling like this isn't really a celebration at all. This doesn't even feel like Geulah. You see in this prayer, this conscious decision, let's make a space for all those emotions of guilt and fear and negativity. And in that prayer, what are we going to do? We're going to have a vidoy where we confess our sins. We're going to say the Yud Gimel Midot, and we're going to emphasize the Horna, right? God's remembrance, Shomer Habrit. God is faithful to the covenant. And this is done as a collective. This is done as the community standing together, that all individuals own their part of their collective guilt and they're part of this collective Jewish history. And so what Nehemiah and Ezra, I think, are really doing in this moment is they're reminding the people of something that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah really do not openly talk about, which is the Davidic king, right? These books, I think the people were probably too scared during this time period to even whisper, oh, we wish we had a king. But what Ezra and Nehemiah are doing is reminding the people, you may not have a Davidic king, you may not have a king at all because you just have governors, right? You're beholden to the Persian king, but you have God as your king. And he did this after Rosh Hashanah. Now we do it. I think this is the inspiration for our practice, that we have to do it around the time of the Yamim Noraim. We do it not on Rosh Hashanah, but we do it before Rosh Hashanah. We give space to the emotions of inadequacy, to the guilt, to the feelings that maybe the covenant with God, is it broken? Do we really feel chosen? Do we really feel like historical events have religious significance? So all of those emotions which run completely counter to the theme of Rosh Hashanah, which is anointing God as our king, we remind ourselves, like Nehemiah's generation did, of that unbroken covenant. And that's what we're doing during Selichot. We're reminding ourselves and God, despite our sins, the bond is unbroken. In ancient worlds, kings viewed themselves as God, right? I very intentionally brought to you that inscription from the Cyrus Edict, just because you see, I think, that idea so blatantly. Kings view themselves as God. And truthfully, in today's world, sometimes it feels like our leaders do the same, that they view themselves as God. And so I think what makes Rosh Hashanah so powerful is we call God our king. It's obviously a metaphor, but it's the day that we really do that, where we really say no man with human arrogance can stand up and say that they run the events of history. Only God can, and it's God with whom we have this unbreakable bond. And so this coming Motzei Shabbat, when we begin, Ashkenazim at least will begin to recite these prayers, I think we're reminding ourselves as individuals, no one is so full of guilt that deserves to be cast aside. But all of us, and I mentioned this last week when we met, all of us have our contributions. All of us contribute to the degradations of society. And all of us, by that same token, have an important role to play in the rebuilding of society and in the repair of our communities. And all of us are able to stand together and proclaim God as our king, and to recognize that our bond with God is unbroken. I'll conclude here. I'll stick around if any of you have any questions or comments. And if there are none, then I will, I'm sure we all wish each other a Shana Tova, Nektiva V'Chatima Tova.
Thank you so much, Adina. We do have one question in the chat, and if anyone else has questions.
All right, I will look to the chat.
Oh, sorry. So the question was sent to me directly, and I'll read it to you. And so someone is asking, why is there no mention of Yom Kippur between Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot in Nehemiah 8?
Yes, that's a great question. So some commentaries suggest that it's quite purposeful to basically emphasize it was the Rosh Hashanah and the Sukkot that year that were the key foundational holidays. I've seen other secular commentaries who suggest that Yom Kippur that year was this day. This is not Rashi and Ibn Ezra aren't saying that. That's an academic who's suggesting that maybe Yom Kippur wasn't on the 10th day that year. But most traditional commentaries pretty much just say, well, there's lots of holidays that Nehemiah doesn't include. The Rosh Hashanah that year, Rosh Hashanah was particularly evocative for Nehemiah because it was a day of tension. It was a day where, well, you say God is king, it's Zichron Trua. Zachor is a key phrase of remembrance throughout the book of Nehemiah. So that's why he mentions Rosh Hashanah. And then Sukkot, because I think the idea of you build a sukkah, he was building walls, you're building the walls of the sukkah, that those two holidays in particular felt like they were particularly resonant. Yom Kippur, not as much, so he doesn't mention it. Curious to your thoughts, but that's the best I got. Any other questions?
I'm curious if the questioner has any thoughts on that. They're welcome to and if again, anyone else have a question?
Oh, you're welcome. So one other quick question. Why this peculiar ceremony on the 24th? Was that an arbitrary date, or, it seems like it was an unprecedented ceremony.
So that would be the day, I think if you calculate it out, that would be the day after Sukkot would end. So in other words, give those who wanted to go home a chance to do so, but those who wish to remain to stay and participate. So in other words, let's let what he's doing is, that's why I tried to emphasize the sense of compartmentalization. He's basically saying, we're going to have a time of celebration, and you can lean into that. But we're also going to have a time of mourning and grief, and an expression and an outlet for all your feelings. And we don't need to always combine it all together. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. We create commemoration days, even in our own society, and that's very important. Otherwise, every day of the Jewish calendar would feel, I think, too much sometimes, given Jewish history. All right. So again, once again, thank you all for joining. Wishing you Shana Tova, to Chaya and to Drisha. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and wishing you all a good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you, Adina, for I really enjoyed this. So timely and relevant, and also it's just so nice to get a little airtime for these a little bit, I think, underrepresented texts. Every time I learn something from Nehemiah, I'm like, why did I not know that existed? So that's really a nice opportunity. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and for teaching, and thank you to everyone who joined and for being part of our learning community. Quick plug, we still have a couple more Elul classes coming up, including the Rudolph family lecture this Sunday with Rabbi David Silver. And then after the Chagim, we're going to be having a series of our fall classes, which have just opened for registration. So do go to drisha.org/classes to check those out. And yes, like Adina said, Shana Tova to everyone. For those of you joining us from Israel, please stay. I guess it's a little late for that, but thinking of everyone's families and loved ones and their safety in this time. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Oh, Darabah.